Welcome to the My Narrative podcast. I'm your host, Yafa Aras. The following is a conversation with Tej. Tej is the Data Production Officer at Axis Bank. He's also an author and consultant, assisting Fortune 500 firms. It helps to build and optimize data management and governance solutions.
Tej, good to have you today on board. Data privacy alignment to data governance. Interesting topic today. And before diving and you telling us why any organization should integrate both, maybe could you define in simple words what's data privacy and data governance?
Well, it's a pleasure to speak with you today on this podcast, Yafa. And data privacy and governance, both in fact are burgeoning topics out there in the industry. They're being supported by policy across the globe, and in fact, most of the organizations are getting to increase their spends and effectiveness programs across privacy as well as governance as well. I mean, the way I see it specifically is data governance is more to do with having to formalize the way we manage data. And what that means is, in some way, any organization would in fact look for assessing quality of the data, monitoring it, getting to simplify their landscapes by managing it by its meaning, and also having to architect landscapes so that they can have better outcomes by reducing on the duplication of benefits and certain choices which in fact can maximize these outcomes. And at the outset, organizations and divisions perhaps were very siloed, maybe 5 years ago. And there was a specific need that came up in the market within these industries and organizations to look at having to formalize the way data is being managed in a very harmonious way. And that is when data governance came into being. And it's a science rather than an act, which in fact looks at having to formalize the way we manage data. And this formalization can be in fact driven by policies, if any organization is policy heavy or policy dependent, or it can be driven through best practices in terms of guiding certain set of teams like platform teams or data engineering teams or data scientists, in terms of having to leverage certain best practices in provisioning data and having to maximize how they derive insights from leveraging existing data or third-party data. And this guidance or policy, in fact, is formalized through a specific function called data governance. And as you know, data privacy has in fact evidently come up in the industry with the laws across Europe, that is the GDPR, as we all know. It's the General Data Protection Legislation. Then we have the CCP out there in the California. Then we have specific laws in Australia and Singapore. India is coming up with its own law, which is called the PDPB. And this is what specifically comes out for privacy for the organization. And the way I see the laws and the policies to be evolving across the regions is that there specifically needs to be a control framework which protects the privacy of the people along with the data they invest into these organizations. And I see regulators having to provide this guidance and direction even before organizations start thinking about how they formalize privacy or management of privacy. So this is my take on data privacy and governance across the industry and its evolution for the past 5 to 10 years.
Okay, interesting. Well, you said quite a few interesting things there, and let me comment on that. few things to unpack, and thank you for this, I think, interesting overview. Don't you think so? Organizations managing their privacy and data governance. So don't you think that that's the step number 2 after actually finding your business case of, in terms of leveraging data, giving a voice to your data, and then figure out, I guess, the governance and privacy. So that's one idea. Second, why do you think that organizations today are still struggling with both privacy management and data governance? And it looks like, I speak to, a couple of senior practitioners in that space, and it looks like that struggles really intensify when they approach both in separately, I guess. And maybe you can comment on the overlaps between the two.
Sure, that's a great take. In fact, in terms of having to look at overlaps between data management, governance, and privacy, and at the outset, to your first question on having to put a business case for privacy management, wherever there is a law existing, like specifically in Europe or California, it's much easy to put a business case around regulation, stating that, it's a regulatory program. An organization is getting to reduce on its regulatory risk. It need not set aside certain pounds or dollars or rupees to save the organization in terms when there is an indemnity that is raised. So these are certain benefits when we look at it from a risk-based approach. But the flip side to it is when we are talking about putting a business case in countries like India, where in fact the law is ethical, it can be a struggle because the skill sets are still upcoming for privacy. And there are certain operation challenges even across the globe in terms of how do we operationalize privacy and pull out an outcome from the programs that are being formalized through these business cases. So having to measure the outcome of a privacy program can be a major challenge. And translating this into benefits and outcomes and articulating it right to the sponsors definitely is a struggle for most organizations, if there is no law around that particular region. We'll come to this conversation later on. I would definitely want to delve into it deeper. But at the same time, talking about the overlaps, which is your second question. If I embark on a privacy program myself, the first step for me is to classify the data. When I talk about privacy classifications, I definitely look at data that in fact directly identifies customer, like a full name, rather than a first name. And I also look at having to classify it based on indirect natural person identifying data, like a city or a state or a zip code. And then there is employee information, health information, and certain other classification schema that I apply over a data landscape. Then there are certain other classifications which might already exist, like the security classifications, where in fact we are very familiar with something like public confidential kind of a schema. And there in fact is master reference and transaction classification schema for data, which is quite popular out there. And having to use existing schemas for the meta model, which in fact might already exist through a metadata program, is in fact the first step for me if I'm embarking on a privacy program in an organization where data management is formalized. So the first step of having to manage these synergies between governance, data management, and privacy is the classification. And having to get these classifications into a catalog along with a glossary will in fact be, a natural evolution for a privacy program. And how do we formalize all this together so that every change that goes through the organization in fact is assessed for its data and its classification of privacy, is a bit of a challenge out there. But if there is data governance in the organization already as a function, assessing every data element that goes through a change in the control environment, it becomes much easier to have the privacy program benefit from these checkpoints across the change. And that is what I do today, which in fact, I'm backing on the existing control environment along with the checkpoints that I have across a change lifecycle to assess for privacy. And this is something which I think GDPR in fact states. We need to embrace privacy by design. And coming to the next aspect, there is data discovery, which in fact is quite important today. While the world is going towards having to democratize data on the heels of data protection, in fact, it's quite important to have a metadata practice that can make sure that every data element in the organization can be easily found by a natural employee. And this is possible with many tools that exist out there. We can set up scanners for databases. We can pull out the metadata from there. We in fact can talk about certain advancements like artificial intelligence that in fact can classify data automatically in the glossary. And coming to the other aspects like having the most accurate data for the people and architecting better choices of technology solutions which host data. This all comes with formalized data governance. And these aspects in fact aid privacy by design in an organization. And having to closely knit through privacy and data governance will in fact be much easier for an organization to take on the aspect of privacy design. So that's my 2 cents on the overlap aspects.
Nice, very interesting, and you shared really, I think, valuable insights in terms of, I guess, the critical components of aligning both worlds, privacy management and data governance. So I guess, I mean, yourself, you're a senior practitioner, and we can't just isolate concepts, technological concepts, processes, and all of that without thinking about people, right? And obviously, you've mentioned we have right here in Europe, we have GDPR, we have another regulation in California, Australia, one upcoming in India apparently. And so how do you manage all that? How do you manage, I guess, the geographical and cultural differences? What would be your approach? Take the best of all worlds and mishmash them all?
Yeah, that's a great operational question, in fact. Well, I went through this challenge, in fact. I would say an opportunity in the past. Working with a global organization, in fact, presents varying requirements of policy put forth by regulatory firms, very specific to geographies. I mean, quoting a very specific example, GDPR today states that data can be classified into personal data and sensitive personal data based on certain degrees of how they directly identify customer or how they can cause harm or embarrassment if the data goes out in the public. But at the outset, if you look at how India is proposing to classify the data, it has set aside a special category of data which in fact can be identified by the government at the later stage, which is being proposed to be a separate data domain, very specifically to manage certain data that will be used for the public good by public authorities. So the way data is being classified today in India can be quite different by the way the regulators in Europe might be expecting firms in Europe to be classifying their data. So at the outset, this presents a challenge. I would still have to maintain my classification schema, which differs from the Indian subcontinent to the Europe. And at the outset, having to zero down on a particular customer and understanding the geographical significance of that particular customer, in fact, is quite important to apply a particular direction or monitoring mechanism to the privacy aspects of the data from this customer. So that is something which I feel is quite important in terms of getting past certain geographical challenges this way. And apart from that, rationalizing of privacy requirements is one other aspect where any data office or a privacy office can bank on. If you look at most of the requirements that have been put across by GDPR, now 70% of these requirements will be based on perhaps 11 best principles of managing data privacy, which we had 10 years ago. Now there is some enrichment and extension to what has been defined as privacy principles, which in fact will be a significant overlap across any law. And that is something which I usually bank on. Whenever there is a certain requirement like data security on the cloud, what should I be using there? Should I be using bring your own key kind of an approach? Or should I be using something like a customer managed encryption for data? Now these are certain aspects which are not provided as direction from the regulators. I still need to take my close call discretion in terms of assessing what is the risk appetite of the organization and having to put across a certain encryption control for data that is moving over to the cloud, which in fact needs to be agreed by the legal as well as the information security as well as the business teams who own the data. And this in fact presents an opportunity to most organizations out there. While there is no specific direction on how data can be put across in a more secure way on the cloud, we still need to come up with our own ways of having to make it more secure. Because today the way I see it is, I take a benefits-based approach to data privacy. Because I see that, I'm creating an organization which in fact should be perceived as a data trust by the people out there. I'm not just banking on regulation or putting up myself for a reputational risk, but it's more to do with having to convert an organization into a data trust so that people can start investing into the organization with their personal data. And that's the way, in fact, I think we should be seeing a seismic shift in terms of how we look at privacy management across the globe.
Yeah, very interesting what you've just mentioned there, and it's a shift perspective almost, right? You'd saying use it as to benefits-based approach, innovation approach, and do you have any examples that you can develop or provide, like any further examples that could benefit our audience and listeners?
Well, I would definitely quote certain examples. I can't go back to my personal experiences, but at the outset, in fact, I was investing into a mutual fund with an investment management firm, and while I invested with a specific mutual fund with a phone number and an email address. And I got to change my mobile number as well as an email address for my second fund that I invested with the same firm. But at the outset, I was not able to bring out my funds, both of my funds with the same email ID or a mobile number because I went ahead and used two different personal mobile numbers. But at the outset, there was some program run by the investment banking firm they tried to bring in a single copy of a customer. They were trying to manage my consents as well for marketing and service and support. And they merged my consents in such a way that, while I was not very keen on marketing for a specific fund, they still went ahead and merged it as an S by taking it from the other fund or the account that I created for the other fund. Which in fact I felt that, is a specific example of how a single view of a customer, along with their behavioral analysis, coupled with their consents for certain processing activities like marketing or service and support or access, need to be looked at in a different way than we look at it today. While the world today is struggling with having to put in certain solutions like master data management solutions or a customer data platform that can give single views of the customer as well as their household to be able to better serve the people. But at the outset, I think having to curate these consents from customers from various customer accounts and getting to bring them together so that it can envelop into one single entity is certain gray space where in fact I think we should be moving towards. That's one of the needs that I felt that the market has, but I myself I'm taking steps to actually work towards having to put a solution in the similar lines.
Yeah. Thanks, Ted. It's a great example, I think, and it's very interesting. So I guess we discussed the geographical, the cultural differences, and I guess the perspective the organization should take on, privacy, data governance, and having sort of, like you've mentioned, benefits-based approach, and you provided a great example on that. So I guess when we talk about these things, I'm just thinking about this, I guess, concept of awareness. Something that's actually, in the world of data and as well as in humans and in a psyche, you can't manage something you don't know exists, right? And maybe you can speak from your experience on that. In regards to, I guess, successful data governance programs, what are your thoughts on this concept of awareness? And do you think this is crucial for teams, organizations to have, successful privacy management programs and data governance programs within an organization?
Yeah, I think that's in fact a great question. And by asking your question, I think you have answered it.
Haha. But how? Tell me so.
Yeah, let me take a stab at that. And in fact, cultural sensitivities vary across geographies. As you have already quoted, while putting up the first data office in the UK 5 years ago, I felt that, the organization was more risk averse because the regulator was pushing on to imbibe divestment as well as building up competition into the landscape, while also having to put certain controls in the environment that in fact can direct and monitor the organization towards safeguarding the interests of people. But if you look at the scenario in India, I can see that organizations specifically are taking a benefits-based approach to data protection and privacy. The very reason being, they see that GDPR was already live 2 years ago, and they know that the law is coming up. And specifically, maybe it's the role of the consultants and people like us who are bringing awareness out there, stating that there is more to regulation and there is more to requirements that come from policy. But at the outset, how can we flip this around? By stating that we are creating fiduciaries for people to invest their data further. while we minimize the data that is curated from the customers at the outset, we also can be able to leverage certain aspects of having to curate further data if a customer is interested in having to invest their particular personal data with us, which we usually call as zero copy data. But for a customer to start investing further with a zero copy data, that is additional personal data, we need to create that ownership, that trust, as well as accountability, which in fact are key principles of how corporate governance exists in organizations today. Now, if you look at how across the globe, organizations are in fact being forced to coexist with the society to in fact make it a more symbiotic kind of a relationship. To have the societies being benefited more, if I were to say that way. And that's where the focus has moved towards corporate governance, having data governance, creating data trust for people, putting in an awareness across the organization that in fact cascades to other stakeholders like a shareholder outside who invests into the organization, and the other natural people who in fact come into the sphere of influence of an organization. And if you look at all these aspects, they are closely knitted, and having to pull one lever that can be an enabler is privacy out here. And this lever can in fact be turned by data governance, which in fact will impact the corporate governance of an organization in the way it's perceived to have an organization exist in a symbiotic way in a society. And that's the way I think even Europe is moving towards. We are looking at organizations having to formalize data governance better and having to enrich on their existing privacy landscapes so that they can create fiduciaries for people to invest their personal data. And that's in fact a better shift that we are seeing in the industry today. And I'm experiencing that myself.
Interesting. So I want to pick up on two things that you've mentioned here, Tej. Do you think that, I guess I'm speaking from a UK-centric perspective, I live here, but do you think that governments should provide greater support to businesses in order to avoid this, I guess, risk-averse approach and foster and enhance innovation within a society and in a nation? Do you think that there's a gap between the two and we should find better ways to cooperate with each other to, again, like you've mentioned, to avoid this risk aversion, because it's in the benefit of all societies and governments to have their own companies, be more innovative and innovate and boost the national economy. Do you think that, I guess, there are any areas of improvement on that end? And the second thing I would love you to develop and probably share your thoughts on that. You've mentioned data trust. And it's a relatively new concept, right? But what are your thoughts on it? Are they actually realistic? Like, for instance, I've recently read an article on MIT Technology Review, and well, in theory, sounds great for companies and end users. It's a win-win, but in reality, is it actually practically feasible?
Yeah, I think the second question, in fact, strikes me vividly, but I can take up the first question. Well, there is innovation that in fact can be fostered into the organizations today, so that we can look beyond the regulatory requirements on how better we can help the people out there by having to protect their interests and their personal data, by managing it and governing better. But at the outset, the regulators did their part in terms of having to provide basic guidance perhaps breadcrumbs for the organizations in terms of having to take these baby steps to reach a certain control environment or a state in their control environment, where in fact they need to start thinking about and beyond what exists as regulatory requirements today. So I think the data officers along with the privacy officers really need to get a, maybe we should say an electric shock, to get to have this innovation kick-started within their organizations. But at the outset, I have seen certain regulations, in fact, like the Data Governance Act out there in the Europe. And in fact, India is coming up with its own act of even governing and managing non-private data. So these are certain policies which I see definitely can foster innovation. And there is this new concept of having to create intermediaries who in fact host data. By seamlessly having to share data between organizations. Because we all know that, we just can't keep data with a lid and it increases its intrinsic value. So as organizations get to share data, the intrinsic value of the data improves. And that's what is being fostered today. If you look at most of the policies that are in the making. But at the outset, my advice has been to these organizations, whomever I speak to think beyond regulatory guidance and having certain aspects of innovation using technology like artificial intelligence to bolster on some of these efforts that in fact can create fiduciaries where in fact they can really make a change to their corporate governance, where shareholders in fact get the essence of how this cascading impact of trust maximizes from internally being within the organizations to going outside the organization. And in some way, I think I'll cascade further to your next question. Is trust, ownership, accountability, and the outcome of having to manage privacy a qualitative enabler? Definitely it is a qualitative enabler. We need a specific yardstick which in fact can look at having to measure the outcomes from this. It can be as sensitive as having to look at the sentiments of customers. Why not do a survey out there with your customers or with an organization's customers in terms of having to look at how they feel about the organization being considered as a data trust. I think the answer will be out there. It can be just a random sample or a random sampling of the customers and asking them questions. And there are more mature ways and approaches and frameworks which in fact I'm designing right now, and some of them I have implemented. That's coming out in my next book, which is Practical Ways and Approaches to Put a Data Risk Governance in an Organization. I'll be happy to hand over a copy over to you.
Thank you.
Would like your thoughts there.
Yeah. And thank you, Tej. And actually, it's a nice segue. You talking about book. I've read your book, your first book, I guess, and I think it's your first, right? I make sure I'll share the links to I will add the links to the show notes for listeners that are curious to have a quick browse on it. But you've mentioned something that I think we should definitely cover about, board structuring and lines of defense. If we can't talk about data privacy and data governance without talking about that. Would you like to have a go at it and develop a bit more about this concept?
Yeah, sure. In fact, this is one aspect whenever I bring up in my community of data privacy and data governance, they ask me to develop further and perhaps influence their thoughts. But nevertheless, I think every organization has its own way of having to build its lines of defense. So at the outset, if we take an organization which is quite large enough, doing some billion of pounds or dollars in revenue, we specifically can look at three lines of defense, which is the first line, second line, and third line. I won't delve into it deeper because the community will be well aware of it. But at the outset, where does privacy fit in? That's a $1 billion question out there. While some of the advocates of data governance state specifically that data privacy is in fact one of the dimensions of data management, and it should fit in the first line, sitting with the business owners, while the business in fact has the ownership of data. There is also a secondary part which in fact states that the privacy function should actually coexist with the risk along with the information security function in the second line. While it's very clear what the third line does, it in fact monitors and assesses the specific controls that have been put across by the first line as well as the second line guidance that has been provided. But I see that in most of the mature organizations, data is being managed with rigor in terms of having to monetize data or using business intelligence and artificial intelligence to derive insights that can add up to the revenue streams. And since there is significant investment made into data management and governance, having to pick up the overlaps which we discussed earlier and developing on a privacy function within a business data office is much easier. Now for starters, in fact, they in fact are trying to have the privacy office with IT, which also makes sense because we can think about privacy office to be a part of IT risk office in the first line, which synonymously gets guidance from the second line risk office, along with the legal function as well as the information security function. And this is one of the approaches in which organizations are trying to start their privacy functions. They're starting with IT, and as they mature, they're getting to have the business own the data, and seamlessly the ownership of privacy in fact shifts from IT to business within the first line. And I have seen such overlaps between data management and governance where in fact I sense that having the privacy function along with data management function in the first line gives an outcome that in fact is much faster, that is more efficient and stronger. But there still needs to be a second line as well as a third line, directing, assessing and monitoring the privacy controls that have been put across the landscape. So these are various flavors of how the organization models are structured. Now specifically talking about the board structuring. As I was stating earlier, data governance is getting to seismically impact corporate governance levers and principles, very specifically on accountability, ownership, tone at the top, and cascade to the grassroots, and certain other aspects like ethics and awareness. Now, when we talk about awareness, which we already did, the crust of the organization in fact lies in the first line. And having to build awareness in the first line is much seamless when you have a division imbibed and stewards identified across these business lines who can in fact start slowly imparting awareness on privacy and data management. And there should always be the voice heard from the first line into the board through a C-level, and that definitely comes through a chief data officer if he or she is already on the board, or it can come through a chief risk officer, or it can come through a chief information officer. But at the outset, the most important aspect is to be able to present to the board on what in fact exists today, what are the capability gaps, what is the strategy for the following year, what are certain aspects which if we are able to build today, can in fact present ourselves as a data trust. So these are certain narratives which every organization should take to in fact be heard to the board, or to be able to put someone on the board who can present these, aspects in its natural form, so that certain decisions and sponsorship activities to formalize programs that can take the organization further steps to, change these enablers for corporate governance.
Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah. And you provided such a great overview for listeners here. And, corporate governance principles. We briefly covered, I guess, the concept of awareness. I want to pick up something that you also mentioned, the ethics, right? In principle, organizations, they should, I guess they must, build transparency and, I guess, empower their staff, right, to understand the responsibilities around the use of data. It's a tricky one because don't you think that actually ethics are driven by a company's values? It's different from regulatory. So what's the place here for data ethics in this whole world of, I guess, privacy, data governance? Can you speak around that?
Yeah, sure. That's in fact one of the topics which I wanted to touch upon. Ethics as well as accountability and building trust within an organization as well as outside the organization. Now, data ethics is something which for the past 1-2 years has been garnering interest even outside the firms from stakeholders in terms of how we process data as organizations. Are we doing it for the benefit of the customers? Or are organizations in fact processing personal data for their own legitimate benefit, which in fact is fined by regulators? Now there is a trade-off which definitely an organization needs to make between a legitimate interest of having to process data, between having to do it very specifically for the benefit of the customer. So today, if I'm a data officer, I can still argue that, I'm processing certain behavioral aspects of customers so that I'll be able to make a good impact to the customer by knowing what he or she needs in the future. Now, these are certain questions which every organization still needs to ask themselves. And as we start asking these questions in a greenfield way, not having to channelize the thoughts of the board or, the data office or the privacy office, we'll be able to sense the sentiments of, how the processing of a data is being performed in an organization. Now, I would definitely recommend having to do this brief assessment on how various aspects of data processing as well as data management and governance add up to the data ethics. Now, there needs to be a framework, an overarching framework, which in fact says that today if I build data ownership in an organization, if I have business owners owning up the quality of the data, the definitions of the data, the architecture of the data, it becomes much easier to ensure that ownership as it is present can be cascaded to data ethics or ethics in general. Now, if I'm seeing that accountability in terms of risk, if we present it in the form of a data breach, having business taking accountability of a breach through various data sharing contracts that they have in place, or the way the processing of the data is being performed, in fact cascades across to ethics as such. And trust is one qualitative enabler, where in fact certain tools out there from the vendors have created trust scores for data in the way that various analysts for data are perhaps hosting and consuming data and putting in their trust scores on if a certain data element like a customer name or a nominee name is in fact trustworthy by the way it is being provisioned, and is it qualitative enough. And we can use certain frameworks which in fact can build up a trust score, and this in fact can be cascaded to the ethics. So at the outset, these three enablers, ownership, accountability and trust, directly cascade to data ethics, and having to measure an organization's landscape as well as the people and the processes along with technology capabilities, very specifically with a framework that can measure these three enablers, will in fact help us understand to do a dipstick check on how in fact there is an ethical culture of managing data and governance within the organization. And that's the practical way of having to do it.
I love it. Thank you. I love how your, insights and example are very practical. I love when practitioners are practical because we're doing things at the end. We are not in academia. So Tej, throughout our conversation, I think you've mentioned, about twice the role of automation and AI. And, well, I love AI and automation, so let's just quickly cover that, And what are your thoughts on, automation and AI and how it could actually help us in the industry, in regards of managing these programs and, privacy management programs and activities. What are your thoughts on that, and how do you think it could benefit us, moving forward?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is an important aspect to touch on. The other day I was speaking to a data analyst and I was asking him, apart from data modeling, which is your core competency, what do you do? He was saying that I'm a data scientist as well. So these days I think I'm finding more data scientists than data architects and modelers. So definitely I think we should be able to see more application of artificial intelligence and machine learning, which I'm seeing on the ground. Because at the outset, I'm able to use artificial intelligence to classify data better for myself. I'm able to do my privacy classifications for various dynamic schemas in their own geographical context by not having to do it manually, but by doing it automatically. And also I'm able to leverage certain solutions in the market which actually automate privacy impact assessments. So I no longer have to put up these control questions in an Excel sheet, having drop downs. I need not go back and forth in terms of setting up meetings with each of the business lines and functional owners in terms of filling up these questions. It is more automated today. And once the responses come back from each of the business lines and functional owners, I am further able to slice the particular responses, arrange them in line with the risks, the controls, and I am able to map them back to the overall control framework in an automated way. I never thought of this 2 years ago, perhaps, but automation is in fact there in the privacy industry as well. And the other aspect where I see innovation coming through in the form of artificial intelligence is having to capture entitlements associated with certain personal data and having to translate these privacy requirements into security controls, perhaps access controls or masking or pseudonymization or anonymization or in fact encryption for data at rest and in motion. So I'm seeing that, dynamic frameworks have evolved, which are being driven by artificial intelligence based on the classification of the data and the entitlements of data. The technique can be automatically chosen in terms of anonymizing data and making it more secure. And as I was talking about earlier, the master data management has in fact evolved to curate a single profile of consents across the leads as well as customers. And one specific example I was quoting is a lead getting converted into a customer and consents being provided by one single natural person across various states of how he is perceived as a customer needs to come together in a 360-degree view, which in fact can give an organization a better sense of how in fact processing of data or reachability of the customers or contacting the customers can actually work better. So these are certain artificial intelligence as well as technology initiatives which in fact I am seeing in the market. I am able to personally leverage them in terms of reducing my operational cost, but in fact having to enrich on my other areas which need focus.
Wow, Tej, we covered a lot of, I guess, crucial themes, concepts around data privacy alignment to data governance. So what do you think organizations should right now stop, tweak, continue, and start when it comes to data privacy alignment to data governance?
Yeah, the only mantra that I can think of right away is for organizations to put aside the hat of risk-based approach to having to look at privacy and governance and having to perceive data privacy in the form of having to create benefit for the customers. So that's my mantra out there, which in fact I am imparting today. My book is about having to practically do it. Happy to share that copy across to you as I release it the following months. Yeah, that's my 2 cents here.
Well, thank you. Well, Tej, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And I have one last question that I always ask my guests before wrapping up. What are the 3 skills and or character traits that helped you so far in your life?
Okay, now I need to pick my head. So let me take a different approach to this. I'm an abstract painter. So my persona comes in a way that, I like to knit things together. While I can say that I'm a generalist myself, I still prefer to be a specialist in, certain aspects like, again, maturing data management and governance and privacy. And also, I think naturally, it's a way that I have been evolving from being a software engineer to a business analyst to a consultant to being a data officer and then a data protection officer. I think this natural evolution has in fact made me go through certain personas, having to hone certain skill sets like design thinking, which I never thought of before, on having to approach a problem in a different way. And also not to throw away any thought, but to write it down, because I definitely know any thought that comes over to the mind of ours will be quite useful even 2 years down the line. So these are certain aspects which I think, have actually built my persona as I travel through my career.
Sweet. Well, Tej, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Yafa. The pleasure has been mine.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the My Narrative podcast. If you enjoy the content, we welcome your support by contributing on Patreon. Find out more at mynarrative.co.uk. Bye.